In this video, I'm going to show you how I set up my color management using nodes and how this benefits my color grades as well as my color grading process. Now, if you're a little shaky on color management or you're not super confident with the core concepts, that's totally cool. We're actually going to end up getting a pretty good primer on color management in the course of today's video, and we're going to end up covering the fundamentals, the building blocks of color management with the process that I outlined for you here today. So before we dive into Resolve, let's just get a quick recap of what color management is. What is our basic goal when we are color managing? Essentially, we want to take what the camera saw and transform it into what our display can show. Or to put it maybe an even simpler way, we want to get a basic reproduction of our image that looks like what we would have seen if we had been standing there at the moment that the image was photographed. So that's the whole goal of this entire color management, this entire scene to screen journey, is to get that basic accurate reproduction that gives us a great foundation that we can do our creative color grading on top of. Okay, so we're going to go through how I set up that pipeline in nodes here inside of Resolve right now. All right, so I've got a timeline here with images that come from a couple of different cameras. And because they come from different cameras, they are going to require some different treatment. But let's start by focusing on these first three shots. These first three shots happen to all have been gathered with Arri Alexa cameras using the Arri Wide Gamut Log C3 color space. Now, right off the bat, a question that often comes up when we're learning about color management is, how do I know that color space? What if I don't know that color space? There's actually some great recommendations in my color management cheat sheet. I will leave a link to that in the description for today's video for how to navigate that process of figuring out what your color space is and how to use it inside of Resolve. But for now, let's say that we know what our color space is. And in the case of these first three shots, it's Arri Wide Gamut, Arri Log C3, okay? Here's what I'm going to do with these first three shots. I'm going to take advantage of Resolve's group function, and I'm going to hold tap on shot number one, and then hold shift and tap on shot number three to select all three of these shots. I'm now going to right click and say add into a new group, and I'm going to label this group Alexa. Now, before I hit OK, I want you to take note of the two dots that are currently sitting above my node graph here. These represent the clip level of my node graph where I currently am. That's where I can do clip level adjustments that are going to be specific to the clip in question. And this other dot, if I were to tap over to it, is the timeline section of my node graph. We're actually going to be making use of the timeline section of the node graph in just a couple of minutes here. But for now, I just want you to notice there are two dots here. One represents the clip level, one represents the timeline level. And the reason I ask you to pay attention to this is once I hit OK on this group that I'm creating here, that number of dots is going to increase from 2 to 4. So now instead of just a clip and a timeline section of my node graph, I also have group pre-clip and group post-clip. Group pre-clip is really why I wanted to use this group functionality. This is a great place for us to perform the first of our two steps in our color management journey. That first step is to get my image, regardless of its original camera color space, into a common working or grading color space, or what Resolve sometimes calls a timeline color space. That working space that we're going to be using today, that I virtually always use when I'm color grading, is DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. So how are we going to go about this? What we're going to do is we're going to go to our effects and grab a color space transform and drop it onto node number one here at the group pre-clip level of this group. Now, I just want to call out this group pre-clip level, whatever I'm doing in here is specific to the group I'm working within. So if I have other clips that are not in this group, then they will not be subject to the nodes that I'm creating or adjusting within here. But any clips that are members of this group are all going to receive the adjustments of this node as their very first operation before I even do my color grading. And that's perfect because I want to do all of my color grading in the working color space of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, okay? So for this, we're going to say input color space, Arri Wide Gamut 3, Arri Log C3, output color space, DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, and I'm going to set my tone mapping to none. We generally don't need to do anything in these sections when we're going from a camera space to a working color space. And this is also a great place to point out that you'll often hear discussions about, oh, I color manage in my project settings, or I color manage using CSTs. Or you might even hear someone say, oh no, I don't color manage, I just use CSTs. And I want to emphasize something. CSTs, color space transforms, versus color managing in your project settings, that's actually the same exact thing. It's the same math, it's the same science driving the operation. We're just invoking it or applying it using different mechanisms, okay? So it's different paths to the same outcome. So I'm going to label this node in, and this is now my input that is taking all of my area material into my common working space of DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. But as you can see, while I'm having an effect, I haven't exactly accomplished the goal of getting a normalized image on my screen, getting an image on my screen that feels like it could be what I would have seen if I'd been standing there when the image was captured in the first place, right? Still feels kind of flat, still feels kind of loggish. That's because I'm still in a log color space and I haven't performed the second in my two-step color management journey for all the images in my timeline. That second step is to go from my working color space out to my display color space. And because that working color space is always going to be DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, and that output color space is always going to be the same for any particular project that I'm tackling at that moment, we are going to do this at the timeline section of the node graph that I mentioned a moment ago. So essentially what we're saying is that by the time my image reaches this point in its signal flow, it's already received an input transform that has gotten it into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. We've already done our color grading. We've already done our creative macro level transform, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And we're now ready to get out to our display. How are we going to do that? You guessed it, color space transform. Same exact mechanism that we used before, only this time our input will be DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate because that is the color space that we last moved into over here at the group pre-clip level. And the output is going to be Rec 709 Gamma 24, okay? Now, because we are going out to a display color space now, and really to a display with a finite color volume and dynamic range, there's a few more settings that we want to get correct here in order to get a consistently pleasing image on the screen. First thing we want to do is use some tone mapping. I'll show you what I like to do. This isn't the only valid solution, but it's one that works really well for me, project after project, and you're welcome to use this or experiment with doing something else. What I like to do is use luminance mapping, set my custom max input to 10,000 and a custom max output of 100. And here under my gamut mapping, I'm going to say saturation compression. And really what both of these things are doing is ensuring that as I reach the limitations of my display in terms of the brightest pixels that it can show and the most colorful pixels that it can show, that we are gracefully decelerating to that edge and nothing is crashing or clipping or looking really strange as a result of there being too much color in the source image. That makes sense? And then the last thing here that I'm going to leave turned on is this forward OOTF. OOTF is shorthand for opto-optical transfer function, or what's sometimes called system gamma. We could do a whole video, maybe we should do a whole video just on tone mapping, gamut mapping, and the OOTF. But for now, suffice it to say, these are the settings that I virtually always use in my color management. They work really well. They're a really good template to operate out of, and you can experiment with them as you wish in your adventures with color management, okay? So this is our output transform. I'm going to call this one 2709, all right? Now, my first three images are good to go. I have accomplished that goal of getting a reproduction of my original scene as it would have generally appeared to me if I'd been standing there at the moment this image was photographed, right? Pretty cool. That gives me a great foundation for beginning to perform my creative color grading because I've got a baseline of accuracy and I have a somewhat normalized image for my display. But there's a couple of other shots that we need to deal with here, right? The next two are not in the Arri log C3 color metric at all, are they? These are actually in red. So we need to handle the first leg of the journey a bit differently. We need to get these into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate so that by the time they reach this point in their signal flow, they are feeding the proper image state into this color space transform, okay? So we're going to set up another group for our red material. I'm going to go over here to the clip level of my node graph, right click, and I've just held down Command or clicked one clip and then held down Shift and clicked the second one to grab that range. And I'm going to right click, say add into a new group, and we'll call this one red. This one is going to require something different here at the group pre-clip level. And before we even do our group pre-clip settings, there's something very important that I want to call out here. These shots are R3D or raw files, okay? Now, this is one area where there's a little bit of extra diligence we have to do when we're color managing in nodes versus color managing in our project settings. When we are color managing in nodes, we need to make sure that our image is being debayered from its raw state into the proper color space. So I'm going to go to my project settings, and I'm going to go to camera raw, and I'm going to go to my red raw profile. And you can see I've already got my debayer settings set up as I want them to be. I'm using IPP2 color science. I'm using the red wide gamut RGB color space and the log 3G10 gamma curve, okay? These are Red's recommended color spaces for decoding raw material. And this gives me a sensible point that I can color manage from in the group preclip section of my red group, okay? I'm also going to check my ISO and color temp to make sure that the metadata that the cinematographer or the operator was using are being carried forward through my grade. I'm going to hit save here. And now here at the group preclip, once again, color space transform. We know where we're going, right? DaVinci wide gamut, DaVinci intermediate. I'm going to turn my tone mapping off and my inverse OOTF off because I don't need those things. And here in this case, my input is not Arri log C3 wide gamut 3. It is red wide gamut RGB, like so, and red log 3G10. These are the exact color spaces that we just reviewed in our project settings, right? So we've now got our mapping from camera color space into working color space. And just like we did for our first 3 shots, we have now built a sound journey from scene out to screen for our 2 red clips, right? So we're almost home free. We've just got one more clip to look at, but this clip is one that requires some special attention. First of all, it looks really wrong, doesn't it? It looks really zany. When you see an image like this where things look nuked and blown out and clipped and really harsh, oftentimes what you're looking at is an image that has essentially been double transformed because it is already in Rec 709. Because if we look at this right now, we haven't added this clip to a group at all. We have no group pre-clip CST happening at all for this clip, right? So all that's happening is it's coming in and it's going straight through this output transform at the timeline level of my node graph, which is expecting DaVinci wide gamut intermediate as its input and is outputting Rec 709 gamma 2.4. But if I turn this off, I'm already in Rec 709 gamma 2.4. How do I know that? Because the image looks somewhat reasonable. There's no way to explicitly know what color space was being targeted when this image was made, but it's already baked. It's already normalized. It doesn't look flat and log the way my other images did before I applied color management to them, right? So this image is already in Rec 709. So what do we do with this? One sensible thought would be, well, if it's already in Rec 709 and I'm going to Rec 709, can't I just get out from underneath this stack just for this clip because it's already where it needs to go? And that would be sensible, but there's actually a better approach that we can take, because even though we're starting in 709 and ending up in 709, it turns out there are some benefits to going through our same intermediate or working or timeline color space of DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to add this clip into a new group. Right click on the thumbnail, say add into a new group, and we'll call this one 709. Now we're going to go to the group pre-clip level once again, and we're going to do a CST. We know where we're going, right? DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. And for our input, I'm going to say Rec 709 gamma 2.4. By the way, this is not such a clean cut operation when you're going from a baked image or a display state image back into what we could call a scene or a working space like DaVinci wide gamut intermediate. So 709 is a good color space. Your gamma, you might get better results with gamma 2.2 or with Rec 709A as another option, or Rec 709. This is just something you can play around with. I'm going to stick with gamma 2.4. And here I'm going to use my tone mapping kind of like we do at the timeline level with that CST, but we're going to do it kind of backwards. So we're going to say luminance mapping, custom max output. You could go all the way to 10,000 if you want. I generally find between 1,000 and 2,000 is plenty. And for my custom max input, I'm going to basically sweep and try to make sure I'm recovering all the detail that I can without just smashing the highlights and dimming them down for no good reason. As you can see, I'm starting to here. Like if I go low enough, if I'm down in whatever, like the 60s or the 70s, you can see when I start to move this max input up from here, I'm actually recovering a little bit of detail, right? But if I'm going much past that point, the highlights are just getting dimmer without actually recovering any additional detail, okay? So I'm going to set this to around 120 and say there's not much more detail to be recovered past that point. And this is my input transform, or what's sometimes called the IDT for my Rec. 7 or 9 material. And as I said, it may sound a little bit counterintuitive to say, oh, I'm going to leave Rec. 7 or 9, even though that's exactly where I'm headed back to. But as I said, it turns out there are benefits to moving everything even into a common color space, even if they are starting, as this clip is, in the color space that we're going to be going right back out to. And I want to talk about a couple of those benefits right now. Now that we've got color management set up for everything, the next thing in my process that I'm going to do is set up a macro level creative transform, or what I call a look, okay? We're going to do that by prepending a node from our upstream of our output transform. And in my case, I'm going to go into my LUTs folder, and I'm going to go into my Voyager subfolder and find the camera LUT from my Essentials pack. I've already auditioned this. I think it looks really nice on the shots in this timeline. And I'm going to use this as my sort of baseline preferential or creative rendering. And I just want to point out, like, there are shots, like there's grading that needs to be done. This shot feels under to me right now. This shot feels a little bit under. This one might be a little bit open, but I've got a nice baseline creative transform here that is in place in my timeline. And this is something that only works if everything is in one common color space prior to being output into Rec. 7 or 9. So that's one of the reasons why I like to move everything into a common color space, so that I can use LUTs like my Voyager pack, which expects and returns DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, so that I can use those things. The other main reason why I like to move everything into a common working space, regardless of where it started, is for feel. Because when I actually get into doing my clip level grading, like say on a shot like this, and I need to expose this up, I'm used to working in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. I know how to make this image look and feel good really fast. I know what my tools are going to do in my hands before I even reach for them, because I always work in this space. The feel is consistent. If I were grading this image in one color space and shot 6 in a different color space, I would have more difficulty connecting with my image and knowing where it needed to go and what tools I needed to use to get there. So working in a common color space is excellent for feel and for getting an intuitive sense of how to push your image quickly and effectively in the direction that it needs to go, okay? So that's how I like to set up my color management in nodes. By the way, this is actually how I do my color management. I prefer to color manage in nodes versus in my project settings. And I want to talk just briefly about some of the reasons why that is, because we've already highlighted, like, there's a little bit more involved with this, right? And you kind of have to get your ducks in a row and have things in an organized place. Otherwise, it just seems complicated, and it can feel more difficult than setting things up in your project settings, which can almost feel like just a couple clicks and then you're there, right? But here's the couple of things that I really like about color managing using nodes. Number one, when you are learning or you're wanting to firm up your understanding of the concepts and building blocks of color management, it's a lot easier to learn them when everything is spelled out in nodes. If I look at any shot in this timeline right now, I can see its full journey. It's going from Area Wide Gamut 3 log C3 into my working space of DaVinci Wide Gamut. My color grading, whatever that color grading may or may not be, is happening here at the clip level. And then over here at the timeline level, I'm going through a creative look, which expects and returns DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And finally, I'm flowing to my output transform, which takes me from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate out to Rec. 7 or 9 Gamma 2.4. Those same exact things would be true if this color management had been set up in my project settings. I mentioned that a couple minutes ago. However, it would not be so easy for me to visually see those building blocks because they're kind of under the hood and hidden away when you're setting things up in project settings. So I think if you are learning color management, or if you're wanting to firm up your understanding of color management, it's really good to set things up in nodes in this way, because it's going to help you to build that understanding of the flow from scene to screen. That's number one. Similarly, when you're talking about being able to very quickly call up and walk through that process, this can be really good for troubleshooting. Like, for example, if I was looking at my image right here and going like, gosh, why does it not look right? Why doesn't it look normalized for my image? Well, if I can walk through things and go from A to Z and look at my input transform here and say, oh, my camera didn't shoot in Rec. 7 or 9 as its gamma, it shot in log C3. it's very easy for me to troubleshoot and identify problems and adjust those in a way that can sometimes be more difficult when it's just some different drop-downs and abstract parameters that are hidden inside of our project settings. So those are some of the benefits that I see to color managing in nodes in terms of seeing those building blocks. Here's the other really big one that can be huge depending on what you're trying to do. When you are color managing using your project settings, you have no ability to get to the left of this node, this input transform, or to get to the right of this node. You have to do everything in your working color space. And that's not always a bad thing. In fact, that's most of the time exactly what we want. That's why we call it a working color space. That's where we want to do our work, right? However, there are any number of situations where you might want to access your image in a state prior to mapping into that working space or after being mapped out to the display space. And if you want to do that, you have to color manage in nodes. You cannot get there by color managing using your project settings. So if you want that greater control and flexibility in terms of how you can manipulate your image, that's a great reason right there to consider color managing in nodes. So I hope you guys find that helpful on a conceptual as well as a practical level in terms of what color management works, or rather how color management works when we are doing it in nodes, how that flow works to get from scene to screen, how you can set things up in nodes so that you have easy access to visualizing the full journey, while at the same time being able to grade without much distraction. As you can see here, I can now proceed like grading each of these shots up individually and not having to look or think about my color management at all because it's living off in group sections, pre-clip section, or in the timeline section. And I've got a free and clear node graph for doing my clip level grading. So it's a good combination of giving me easy access to that journey when I want to see it without it cluttering my node graph when I don't. And there's overall some greater flexibility to the process, as well as greater ability for me to visualize the journey, troubleshoot the journey, and customize the journey beyond what I can necessarily do in my project settings. So hope you enjoyed this. We're going to be diving even deeper into this subject in the next episode of my live show that we do here on the channel, Grade School. So if you have questions or something that's confusing to you about this, hope to see you in there, and we can dive even deeper into the subject of color managing using nodes.